Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at kings, succession, and a social contract. I'd like to go back to France in the late 1500s. We have there 1572, the St. Bartholomew Day Massacre. The setting for this was that the Catholics had been ruling France under the sons of Catherine de' Medici, and meanwhile a growing number of Calvinists, especially among the nobles, who were turning to this. So remember, Calvin and the Reformers had an emphasis in education, so it made sense that the nobility, those people that were educated, were turning toward this view of Christianity. The term Huguenot seems to come from two, I guess, a German and a maybe Dutch word, I forget, thrown together. It carries the idea of a housemate. They would come and study together secretly this theology, and this was a growing concern to the Catholics ruling France. And so, as a way to diffuse the situation, there was an arrangement of a marriage of the Catholic Margaret de Valois to the Huguenot Henry of Navarre. Everyone was invited to the wedding when there was an attempted assassination of a Huguenot noble, and suddenly this sparked trouble. Fearing an uprising, de' Medici had her son authorize the murder of all the Huguenot leaders. In that year, St. Bartholomew's Day, 1572, 70,000 Protestants in a single day were killed in France. Now, this left Henry III, the last surviving son of Catherine de' Medici. He was the King of France. But there was a Protestant, Henry of Navarre, who was the next in line for the throne. You see, he hadn't been killed in that regard. And meanwhile, there was a third Henry, so this is really the situation of the three Henrys. Henry of Guise, the head of the Catholic League. And Henry III was forced to flee Paris when Henry of Guise invaded Paris on the day of the Barricades. This was the following year. So he invaded, and Henry III was forced to flee. As retribution, Henry III had Henry of Guise murdered, but then the third himself was murdered by a Roman Catholic monk. This was, remember, Roman Catholics against Roman Catholics. They weren't getting along with each other. And so Henry III was murdered, and that left Henry of Navarre, this Protestant, next in line for the throne. Talk about, how the pendulum has swung within the space of a single year. So now we have the age of the Huguenots in France, Henry of Navarre, but what he does as he comes to the throne, he converts to Catholicism in order to be accepted as the King of France. His quip is that Paris is worth a mass. Now I'm not sure how heartfelt his conversion was, but he goes through the motions at least of converting, and then a few years later passes the Edict of Nantes, which makes it legal to be a Protestant. The Huguenots are allowed to worship privately. Now, they're not allowed in the city of Paris, but they are allowed to not be murdered, and they're allowed to worship privately. But like I said, they're banned from Paris and other major cities. Now, all of this is in the backdrop of this idea of the divine right of kings. The church taught that first there was God, and then there was the Pope, and remember, the church was teaching that the Pope had the authority to put the crown on the king, going back to Charlemagne. Remember how that had taken place? And then under there you have the nobles and the people and everyone else. Well, the kings were really pushing a different formula. They were saying there's God and there's the king. That's the divine right part. And yes, the Pope, he's over there, but he's in charge of spiritual things, and we're in charge of physical things. And so you go from the king to the people, and this is that idea of the divine right of kings. It's exemplified, that idea of the divine right of kings is exemplified in Louis XIV, nicknamed the Sun King. His famous expression, l'état c'est moi, the state, it is I. If you want to talk about who is the country, I am the country, I'm everything. And he comes on the scene and revokes the Edict of Nantes, and that Huguenot freedom, and suddenly it's the Protestants all have to get out of town, out of the country again. So that 200,000 Huguenots flee France. Notice the numbers have been growing during that period. Now, also during the time of Louis XIV, we have what's known as the War of Spanish Succession. It's kicked off with Charles II of Spain, who dies with no heir. And Louis XIV says, well, my grandson can be king of Spain, and we'll just take France and Spain and make it into a single nation. Uh, and, and that's, you'd think, well, why would that spark off a conflict? It sparks off a conflict because all of the other nations, whether it's England or the Netherlands or the Austria or Prussia, they all are adamant that they're not going to stand for that. And so the battle begins. It continues until there's a suggested resolve where the King of Austria says, well, we can always unite Austria and Spain. And again, nobody likes that idea either. That doesn't bring peace. And peace finally comes. Peace finally comes when Louis presents a alternative. He says, look, my grandson can be king of Spain, but we will keep it as a separate nation. And everyone says, okay, the King of Austria isn't quite so sure. He liked that previous idea. But finally, when the dust settles, you have Spain as its own country and France as its own country, and they've reached a resolve. Now, this idea of the divine right of kings during this period begins to be challenged. Remember, we talked about the Enlightenment with an Enlightenment ideal known as the social contract. The idea that rulers, and yes, even kings, have the responsibility to act in a way that benefits their people, that the king is really a servant of the people, not just the divine right of kings, who he can just do whatever he wants for his benefit. And this idea will be in conflict with that idea of the divine right of kings. It will bring about a growing tension, which will eventually see revolt and a new way of governing known as, well, going back to the old Roman Republic, but also democratic ideals.